Okay, so I think that we can begin. Hi all, welcome to the Italian and Mediterranean Colloquium. I'm Konstantina Zanou, and this is the first event from the beginning of the pandemic. And actually the first event of the Colloquium that I'm doing from my living room. The Italian and Mediterranean Colloquium is running from some years now, and it's sponsored by organized and sponsored by the Department of Italian and co-sponsored by the European Institute. There will be more events, online events this semester, and I will post the link of our webpage on the chat. Maybe I can do it immediately, so I don't forget about it. So you can check the events that will follow. Now, before I introduced our guest today, let me say how this will work. The event is being recorded, and then it will be posted on the YouTube page of the European Institute, and perhaps, if we make it, on the webpage of the Italian department. In case you don't want to be seen, or you don't want to be seen when you ask the question, you can always type your question in the chat, and I will transfer the question. But feel free to speak and to be seen, because I want us all to feel comfortable here. So our guest today is Claudio Fogu. Welcome, Claudio.
Grazie. Hello, everybody.
So Claudio Fogu, I'm going to read the very entertaining bio that he sent me. Claudio Fogu was trained as a cultural and intellectual historian at UCLA in the late 1980s. He was blessed with being mentored by both Carlo Ginzburg and Hayden White. You can imagine the combination, right? In other words, as he says, by the devil and the holy water. You choose which. Hence, his first and enduring passion for both philosophy and theory of history, to which he dedicated his first book, The Historic Imaginary, in which he analyzed the fascist vision of history as it transpired from the analysis of rituals, monuments, and fascist image culture. Since then, Fogu has published widely on various other fields of interest, ranging from Italian modernism to the digital humanities, and has co-edited 2 volumes, The Politics of Memory in Post-War Europe, published in 2006, and Probing the Ethics of Holocaust Culture, published in 2016, both related to the field of memory studies. After being on the faculty of the history departments of Ohio State University and the University of Southern California since 2006, he has been teaching in the French and Italian Studies Department of the University of California, Santa Barbara. He is the cultural editor-in-chief of California Italian Studies, of which he co-edited the inaugural volume in 2010, dedicated to Italy in the Mediterranean, in fact, a very important volume. And in 2020, the volume 9, entitled Italia Senza Frontiere. He's also a co-founder of the digital journal Zapruder World, of which he will co-edit the 4th volume on performing race. I really look forward to that, to be honest. So the book we're discussing today, and Claudio will post a link in the chat of the page of the book, is called The Fishing Net and the Spider Web, Mediterranean Imaginaries and the Making of Italians. It was just published in 2020, and it results from several years of research and represents a return to his first passion for the study of historical imaginaries. So, Claudio, welcome again, and congratulations on your book.
Thank you.
It is an impressive achievement, I have to say, an extremely rich book, ranging from history to literature, film, art, architecture, and with a long chronological scope, going from antiquity up to contemporary times. I really enjoyed reading it. I learned a lot. It made me think a lot. And as an author and teacher of Italian history, as Mediterranean history myself, I am really, really grateful that this book exists. So thank you for agreeing to discuss it with us today. I was reading a couple of days ago a piece by Arjuna Padurai on the future and past of decolonization on The Nation. It was published, where he writes that instead of viewing geographical areas of the world as natural performed backgrounds against which historical events unfold, we should view them as the contingent results of human actors. Land and water may exist prior to human history, but regions and civilizations are products of human action. In this sense, history produces geography, not the other way around. So this, Claudio, made perfect sense while I was reading your book. You treat Italy and the Mediterranean as malleable regions existing first and foremost in the imagination before becoming palpable realities. With real consequences on the people who inhabit them. But I want to let you explain yourself better what you do here. So let's start with the title, The Fishing Net and the Spider Web. Can you tell us what these two strange things do in your title?
Yes, thank you so much for the question and for actually sort of referring to the meta-geographical, what I would say the meta-geographical status of Italy and the Mediterranean, an argument that has been passionately studied also in terms of the cartography of Italy and the Mediterranean. And there is some really interesting work that has been done on the parallels between the construction of Italy and the construction of the Mediterranean as meta-geographical areas. But in terms of specifically my the two images that sort of are in the title, I guess this is a perfect way for me to introduce the book for those who might have not had the opportunity to read it yet. The two images of the spider web and the fishing net refers to two models of interaction and connectivity and networking that I identify with the ancient Mediterranean, of course, on the basis of work that has been done by other historians, Irad Malkin especially. In terms of the archaic Mediterranean that I identify with the image of the fishing net and the institution of the Emporia, and the moment in which Hellenians, the Iranians, and Phoenicians sort of dominated between the 9th century and the 5th century, the Mediterranean, constructing it is in what I identify as a kind of fishing net. The spider web, of course, refers to the Roman Mare Nostrum, and not only refers to this completely different centralized image of the Mediterranean, but also to its what I call the territorialization of the sea. This is a concept that is very important to me, in which the sort of the Mediterranean is reduced in the imperium or spider web version to a territorialized sea, and this appears as sea as such. One of the two elements of land and sea is completely dominant and obstructs the other, the vision of the other. So these two images represents a kind of longue durée prequel to the story that I tell in the book. The two images in that sense constitute for me matrices. I call them matrices of different Mediterranean imaginaries, distinct Mediterranean imaginaries that actually pervade the history of Italy, of the Italian peninsula. And my first argument, let's say, argument is that the Emporian imaginary is the one that is dominant throughout the history of Italy up until the late 18th century. It is an imaginary that, of course, we can trace to the maritime republics, but I specifically choose to locate it very specifically in the economic, political, and cultural history of the Kingdom of Naples, which, with the Bourbons in the 18th century, assumes after the decline of Venice a fundamental role in keeping alive and actually culturalize this imaginary in forms that are, I think, very important and sort of that demonstrates a continuity. Part of the argument here is, of course, an identification of this Emporian imaginary with Southern Italy, but it is not exclusive. I see the very signs of Italianness, for example, in the spread of Commedia dell'arte throughout the Mediterranean, as part of the story as well. As, of course, Genoa and Venice are prominent parts of the stories. I don't focus on them because so much work has been done, but I certainly include them. So there is a sense in which Italy belongs to the Mediterranean far more than Europe. This is the major, let's say, overall argument for all of the centuries before its national unification. Of course, the 19th century is the moment for me in which things in the course of the 19th century shift dramatically. And they shift on the one hand in terms of the way in which the South is constructed by what I call a meridianist paradigm that matches the Orientalism, the Orientalist paradigm in constructing an internal other to Europe. The southern shores of the Mediterranean Europe are constructed as an internal other, specifically, of course, Italy, because of its traditional role in the Grand Tour and the importance of Naples as the biggest city and the Kingdom of Naples as the third richest nation in Europe up until Italian unification. So I certainly inscribe this the shifting moment with the classic construction of modernity in the 19th century. And that's where I think the argument starts of the rest of the book, in which I equate the Risorgimento with a kind of imperium imaginary that actually is applied to the rest of Italy. And so I call the Italian Risorgimento, I interpret it as part of this meridianism, implying that the Southern question is more the cause of the Risorgimento rather than vice versa. So that there is actually, that the Risorgimento is already actually an effect of a Southern question that has started much earlier. This is part of the bigger argument. And of course, from then on, the work instead takes the modern history of the Italian nation and the making of Italians and looks at the way in which the resurgence of imperium is actually part of fundamentally the construction of Italian nationalism all the way to fascism, but it is also brings with it the resurgence of emporium as well. So the fishing net and the spider web become the two models that between which the construction of Italian identity and in that sense, the making of Italians oscillates between these two models. And I follow the oscillation from the late 19th century through the work of racial theories, all the way through D'Annunzio and futurism, fascism, and all the way to the present, of course, also with the thought, the Mediterranean thought of Chambers, Cassano, and Italian intellectuals at this contemporary moment. Big explanation, but I hope it sort of gives an idea of how the two metaphors become structuring, but they're also located in a kind of longue durée view of this Mediterranean imaginary.
Thank you, Claudio. Really a beautiful summary of what the book does. And now, since you mentioned this, you mentioned that you started with the archaic Mediterranean, and then you arrive through the unification to contemporary times. I want to ask you to clarify this, to speak a little bit more about this, whether Mediterraneanism or the Mediterranean imaginary, which you call emporia, somehow you connect with emporia, a specific kind of Mediterranean imaginary, right? Whether it is connected to interaction, communication, diasporas, federalism, whereas the imperial European territorial imaginary is connected to the modern centralized state. So in other words, is the one imaginary pre-modern and the other modern in certain ways? Has the continental worldview replaced the maritime view as we entered the modern world? This is a major question.
So my answer might be a little bit Solomonic, but it is yes and no. There is a certain a tendency of mapping the Emporian over forms of interactions and networking that are fundamentally hybrid, creolizations, syncretic, culturally syncretic, and specifically map on federalism as a preferred political framework. This is true for Sergi, this is true for Einaudi, this is true for some of the characters that I explore, including ENI's President Mattei. So I'm going through a mapping that does overlap with certain political institutions. However, I wouldn't map it on modern and pre-modern, precisely because the longue durée is the way in which I try to show that there is, at the level of the imaginary, this is transfigurations. I am speaking about ways in which certain characteristics can be seen morphologically through a pattern. And I would say that if anything, the Mediterranean imaginary is postmodern, if at anything, because it is thoroughly, the image of oscillation is in itself an image that excludes the kind of binarisms that were used and the dialectics, the Hegelian dialectics that we're used to thinking of in terms of progressive history. So there is in itself the two imaginaries and their relationships and what are contained within what I call the Mediterranean imaginary. It is that oscillation. So Konstantina, that's what I mean, yes and no. There is a moment in which there is a patterning and a tendency to absolutely identify the nation state, but only at some point. For example, I would argue that the period that you analyze of the in your book, in the formation of the Italian nations and later, is still full of a transnational elements that I see coming much less at the moment of Italian unification, which is the kind of gateway to imperialism. So I treat Italy as the birth of the empire state rather than the nation state, in a kind of sense in which by that time, the imperium metaphor has become in Italy the foundation of the unification process. And the elimination and the actual suppression of the Emporian traits, both in the South and throughout Italy, is very evident. It's so clear. So there is that relationship by which the imperium imaginary tends to actually suppress and the other. So there is a mapping and also a non-mapping, a non-complete mapping.
Yeah, I have in mind the classes I teach on the history of Venice in the Italian program in Venice, summer program in Venice, where one of the things that we study with my students there is the way Venice transformed when the Austrians arrived, and Napoleon and later the Austrians with the railways and everything. Venice somehow changed, instead of looking at the sea, the backstage, the former backstage of Venice became now the major stage, right? So it's like of changing direction, and of course this all connects to the space, the transcultural space of the Adriatic, which dies as we enter the 19th century, the dissolution of the big empires. And we have people here studying not only Venice, but also Trieste. It will be lovely to see how they think of this transformation. And so, you mentioned the creation of the nation state as a very important moment in the changing of the relationship of Italians to the sea. And I was wondering whether you think that there were forms, there were other ways that this could be done. In other words, whether there were futures of the past which were lost. And I have in mind here, for example, things studied by Dominic Rail, Maurizio Isabella, and myself, like, the fraternal transnational patriotism of the Mediterranean, the Adriatic multinationalisms, and so on, all projects that somehow silence after the unification. And as I really like what you mentioned about Garibaldi, I had never thought about it, I have to say. You say that despite being raised as a sailor and spending most of his military life as a ship's captain and achieving fame as the hero of the two worlds, thanks to his daring maritime exploits, Garibaldi is represented as a general on a horse or standing on ground in almost all of the paintings and monuments that immortalize him. So it's like the sea is completely absent at the moment of the creation of the Italian state. So can you tell us more about this moment which was lost and what other visions could be, and they didn't become, like they could become, but they did not become? Yeah.
I think, Konstantina, your question is extraordinary because it connects my two books in in a way that I had never thought about. But I think maybe the germs of my second books came from my engaging with Garibaldi and his legacy in my first book, because I studied in the archives of the Garibaldian Association of Mutuo Soccorso, which was formed by Garibaldi in 1872. So I immersed myself for years in the history of Garibaldi's family and all of the other remnants. And there really, I was struck for the first time by the way in which Garibaldi's exploits, which were basically his ability to escape. Throughout his campaigns in Latin America, he was famous for being able to always escape by boat somewhere. And that sort of fascinated me, how that history instead had been transformed completely into this terrestrial history of Garibaldi. And I think, but this is a way to say that you're perfectly right. There is a dimension that the imperial, the sort of what I call the imperium structure of Italian unification and Risorgimento can be found in every aspect of the suppression of other possibilities, including, of course, for me, federalism, the disappearance of the most natural and obvious, unique framework that could have accommodated the already federalist in nature. I mean, more than any other nation, but Germany had already experimented. So the model was there. And it was
Cattaneo, right? All the writings
so
Cattaneo.
we keep talking about the fact that he was defeated, but the fact that there wasn't a movement for the affirmation of federalism at the time was something that has always struck me as showing the strength of that imperium imaginary in constructing the kind of main framework of the Risorgimento. And I would say, Konstantina, that the story of the Garibaldini is extraordinary because that Società Mutuo Soccorso in the second, after the Risorgimento, of course, was the one that financed the expedition to Domokos in the 1897 conflict between Greece and Turkey. So Ricciotti and company were back at trying to testify to that fratellanza and to that
Yes.
Mediterranean risorgimento that you and Pecot and others have been, and Lucy Ryle, of course, have been talking about. So, Dominique, I mean, very, very, very important aspects of this. But this is where I would say our books in a way intersect, and not only our books, we've seen it so many times, how there is a kind of puzzle between the books that are around, that bring the Risorgimento and the Mediterranean into connection.
Yes, and I think also what you mentioned about federalism as not being discussed as one of the options, and like not questioning at all why they didn't go there, which would be the most obvious option, right? I think it's just recently that some historians of the Risorgimento clearly start studying the process of unification as a process of different state nationalisms, which would clash of one against the other, not just between the South and the North, but like understand this as a multinational phenomenon, which ended in the way it ended. And okay, but so let me see what I want to ask you next. I want to ask you a little bit about the connection that you make. I really like this between a Mediterraneanness of emporia, right, and Italy as a diasporic country, a migrant nation, as we know from the famous Coates book. I really believe that your book is also a contribution to how we understand diasporas as such, and their changing meanings over time, and especially with the coming of nationalism. Because after nationalism, I mean, in the modern times, when we encounter this label, diasporas, we think of organized communities abroad, often presented as pieces of national life, scattered here and there, in places far away from the national core. We understand them in the way that you describe the spider web, like the Alice core, right, and the diasporas. Instead, it seems to me that you connect here diasporas with the fishing net, not the spider web. So you don't see them as extensions of homeland, but somehow as sites where collective or individual consciousness were constantly shaped, reshaped, negotiated, renegotiated. So instead of being an emblem of a unity of a dispersed people, with an imagined, centered as a point of reference, diasporas become here an expression of diversity, of multiplicity of loyalties and belongings, like the major side of emporia, in fact, like the constitutive element of emporia. And you propose to see Italy, in my reading at least, as a place in a constant movement. Like if we see Italy through emporia, right? It's an Italy, it's how movement is not treated as an exception. It's as if you say, Italians, and most people for that matter, have always circulated, created networks, and settled in certain places. They moved, and these flows, these networks are their homes.
Yeah, I think you said it very well. I think I should have written it down, but because it summarizes something that was a surprise. And I have to say that initially I had not considered the importance of emigration and the discourse about emigration by not only Luigi Einaudi, who was one of the major commentators at the time, but also by many, many others that I discovered on the pages of the Antologia Italiana. What I sort of unearthed is, of course, a couple of, or what I point out is that even at the time, the connection to the ancient Mediterranean and to colonization understood as the expression of a going to return was fundamental to the process. And the data that we have in which Italians were a population that actually emigrated not only from the south, but also from the north, and had a rate of return that went between 50 and 75%, and that many emigrated several times in their lifetimes, does give us this sort of sense in which it was the Mediterranean fishing net that was extended to the Atlantic and over to the Atlantic. And this is also, I think, very important in understanding that 900,000 Italians between 1880 and 1914 emigrated to North Africa, not just across to the Americas. Yes, 4 million ended up in South America, in North America, and 3.8 million in South America, but also 900,000. Italians were the major European population in every single country, with no exception of Northern Africa, whether they were colonized, especially in France, with Tunisia, of course, we know, but Algeria was the same. And even in Turkey, the percentage of Italians was higher. So what we have is an extraordinary movement, one that has been studied also in terms of the politics of anarchism in Northern Africa, which were very, very important and very connected to the role of Italians in that diaspora. So I do see that diaspora as extending the Mediterranean ideally throughout the Atlantic. And I think in that chapter, I bring testimonies that this was not just my view of it, but certainly the view of many commentators at the time who saw La più grande Italia not as a contrary effect to the kind of imperial attempts. And when you look at, for example, Franchetti's 1894-95 attempts at colonizing Eritrea and bring Eritrea to become the colony to absorb southern Italian immigration, it's incredible the way in which Franchetti's attempt fails, precisely because he wants to occupy and make it an agricultural colony rather than stay on the coasts where actually families wanted to stay. And by doing that, he attracted only 2 families from the south, 8 families from the north. But so what you say, 10 families arrived in Eritrea out of the thousands that Franchetti wanted to bring in. So you can see how the maritime projection was very much part of a society that in Italy was instead boxed as società contadina and agricultural by the Southern question. The Southern question territorialized the South, yes, while immigration showed that actually contadini were ready to cross an ocean and also involve themselves into a migrant life across the ocean. That was very much what Italians were, migrants within those continents.
Yes, and I think that this has important consequences in the way us historians tell the story of Italy. If we, it's as if you invite us to read the history of Italy through the migrant point of view, not the point of view of the continental. And so what different stories can be said about everything in that. But one of the, and of course, this is in general, the intellectual program of doing Mediterranean, like opening up Italy to the Mediterranean and to the global, let's say, right? But it seems to me that when we say Mediterranean, okay, the Mediterranean imaginary, the way, all these, the way emporia function versus the imperia, right? Are they, how can I say, are they the good Mediterranean versus the bad Mediterranean? So if we take the emporia as the good Mediterranean, right? The good Mediterranean opening, and the imperia, the imperial Mediterranean vision. So we can see that it's not enough that we talk about Mediterranean. There are many which Mediterranean? There are many Mediterraneans here. And I was wondering that whether these different Mediterranean maritime imaginaries, if you want to see, whether they are in conflict or whether they interact or even coexist. And since you kind of towards the end of your book, you have this beautiful chapter titled Mare Aliorum, the sea of the others and the sea of the migrants, in this case, the migrants that come to Italy. So you connect the Italian migrations to the migrations that Italy receives. I was wondering how the sea of pleasure, what you call Italia balneare, coexist with the sea of death, like the Mare Aliorum. How do these emporia, are the emporia the good Mediterranean and the imperia the bad Mediterranean, or do these two Mediterraneans have bright and dark sides at the same time?
Yeah, this is
may I say something?
the
Fishing net, Claudio, I thought that is a very frightening object if you look at it from the point of view of the fish, right?
Yes, I plead guilty to the fact that metaphors have a life of their own, and imaginaries too. So in that sense, I think I want to make a prequel to my answer, because I think it's important at this point to sort of understand that this is the book about what I call Mediterranean imaginaries. And so many of you might have a question at this point saying, what the hell is a Mediterranean imaginary? I mean, what is it? What do these metaphors refer to precisely? What are they metaphors of? And I have to say that there's no amount of explanation that will be able to, in a certain sense, satisfy a historian that wants a basic foundation to this this book, or that feels that the Mediterranean is in itself already a very amorphous object, and once I transform it into an imaginary, it gets to become even more amorphous. And my notion of imaginary does basically tie and sort of talk about the affective role that images have in structuring our own relationship to things, and to things that are themselves constructed, but they imply a certain affective and emotional type. So I'm saying this because the crucial argument that I'm making is about the oscillation between these two forms of imaginary. They are intertwined in their history as far as I've seen it, as far as I've been able, with long sweeps in which one is dominant in different forms, cultural and political and even economic, and the other, however, is, let's say, submerged and not visible, but still exists. And then in the history of making Italians, I think the two come at the same time. Emporion, however, is also, the fishing net is also the fishing net of slavery in the Mediterranean and the fishing net of piracy. So there is a side to it that it's, from a moral point of view, is completely not kosher, not something that we would endorse. And yet, when I see piracy becoming the foundation of Fiume in 1919, and the Italian, Fiume becoming the place where the whole there is a political and mental conversion of D'Annunzio to Emporion under the influence of the Sindacato dei Marittimi, which is its major sponsor of Fiume. Well, that brings to me a sort of hybrid and a sense in which those moral categories are no longer mapping or matching. And one could argue that the Pax Augustea was the best thing that ever happened to the Roman world. I don't so that the Mare Nostrum defeated a state of or guaranteed commerce in a certain fashion, and I think that argument is perfectly fine. But I would also say that Christianity started as a fishing net framework within now a sea that guaranteed the epistole of Paul to circulate throughout the Mediterranean thanks to the imperium. So there you see the emporium of Christianity and the imperium of Romanity coming into contact. So I'm trying to maintain a flexibility between the way in which these metaphors map on moral and other categories. And I hope I've been able to give enough examples to show that I'm not trying to trap them in univocal ways, and that my argument fundamentally is one of oscillation that is present in this phenomenon.
Indeed, completely, all the time. You think that you think that you end up with a result, and then you come and challenge, and then you say it's all this oscillation all the time. It's like, that's why the book is so fun also. But let's talk a little, since we're talking about fun, let's talk a little bit about islands. I know that you started the whole project also because you love a specific island, and I am an islander myself from Cyprus. I come from Cyprus. So I was thinking about the role of islands. I am thinking, I have been thinking for a while that one of my next books, I want it to be a Mediterranean, a history of the modern, an island history of the modern Mediterranean. I want to see how we see the world from islands, really. This is what I want to do. So when Italy became continental, islands were transformed into places of isolation, imprisonment, and health control, lazzaretti, So the role of islands today have been discussed as insiders and outsiders of the nations. If you think of the nation state, if you think, for example, Pantelleria and Lampedusa, what is happening with the migrants, and how these islands were considered almost outside Italy. But when the first migrants arrived, like all Italian national focus went there, as if they're really an integral part of Italy, these islands. So it's like insiders and outsiders. And also, I don't know if you've seen the film, any of you, the film The Rose Island, about the, which is so fun, the Annie's platforms as island utopias, because you mentioned these platforms in your book. So let's talk a little bit more about the centrality of islands in your story and how, and their changing roles. How do you see them?
Yes. So the islands themselves as physical objects do play a tremendous part in the sort of pre-modern history in the establishment of the fishing net. I basically argued that the fact that we never reflect upon the fact that the Euboeans that left Greece, what we call Greece today, but at the time was only Hellas, as the Egyptians called it, was the Euboeans left an island and crossed the whole Western Mediterranean and didn't stop in Sicily, didn't stop in Calabria. They went all the way to Ischia, and they settled their first colony on the island of Ischia. Why the hell would they miss all those beautiful, bigger lands? Why would they not settle there before? And that, for me, is precisely the way in which I think strategically of islands. Islands as tappe, as nodes of crossing and getting across to other lands or to other islands that are on land. Port cities are islands on land. They have that structure. And of course, Naples is a very special case because the fight between the baroni that want to tie it to the hinterland and the commercial sort of class that is backed by the monarchy, even by the Spanish monarchy, is very crucially also about this. But islands as places in a way are sort of the fish that are caught in the fishing net. and but they relate to going
Excuse me,
onshore.
can you please all silence yourself? Okay, thank you.
Thank
So
you.
go on, Claudio, yes.
So I'm thinking of islands as both metaphoric, because they construct even interlands as islands. And as much as I think about, for example, rivers as bringing crucially the Mediterranean inland in certain relations. So there is something that you capture very well. But for example, the example that you made before of Lampedusa, it's for me, of course, the capital of Mare Aliorum and of Italia Balneare at the same time on the same island. But in this case, Italia Balneare for me belongs to the kind of imperium rather than emporium, because it identifies Italy as a metonymy for the Mediterranean, and in that sense, it actually has made a kind of Mediterranean pret-a-porter for a global consumption, which excludes precisely the hybridity and syncretism that we associate with the Mediterranean of Emporia. That's where I locate islands. And of course, you mentioned my fundamental debt to the island of Procida, which has just been nominated the capital of culture for Italy for next year. And it's interesting because everybody keeps repeating that Procida is the capital of culture, but it's not Procida itself. It's Procida as at the head of a consortium of small islands that includes 35 islands throughout Italy that will be for the first time celebrated as the center of culture and the Phlegrean area as a whole. So Procida is actually coming with an archipelago of islands behind, and not just as island itself. That's where I see the island realizing itself as island, as this sort of laboratory of syncretism.
That's amazing. Let's hope that we will have another talk in one of these islands soon, right? So my last two questions, and because then I want to open the floor to discussion, concern Italian nation making, okay? So, okay, let me start from this. You're trained as a historian, and you put center stage of your inquiry in this book, the historical phenomenon of the making of Italian national identity. You even have it in the title, right? I could not help, however, from noticing that your main interlocutors are philosophers, sociologists, or theorists of literature. You start and close your book with Jacques Derrida, Roberto Dainotto, and your maître à penser, as you say, Franco Cassano. And of course, you use historians throughout. I mean, historians are also always present there. But I should say that I admire this interdisciplinarity, and it's something that I am trying to urge my students to do somehow. But I have a question. Why did you choose to approach the phenomenon of nationalism exclusively through the lens of Benedict Anderson? And in what concerns Italy, Alberto Banti? It seems to me that more recent historical studies from Bailey to Conrad, Osterhammel, Armitage, and Sivasundaram have revisited nationalism after the transnational global turn, and specifically the oceanic turn, and that these historians are much closer to what you're doing. That they're absent from this book, however. And you know, I was thinking how helpful it would be if you would turn your gaze towards this kind of literature, because they have been, you know, talking about decentralized, interconnected, multi-directional, non-hierarchical world. They have criticized. They are, you know, they depart from post-colonial studies, but they have also criticized them for not placing enough emphasis on the syncretic aspects that make societies. So what is more, I think what is even more important is that these authors talk about the concept of a global South, right? And they study this idea of the global South against the so-called global North. So I think that there is a missing link between Italian cultural studies of the construction of Italy's South and the global historiography of the Souths of the world. That's why I want to invite you here to think how we can see Italy as part of the global South, right? Italy and the Mediterranean as part of the global South itself, but also Southern Italy as the southing of Italy, if we can say, of part of Italy, as part of this discussion on the global southing of the world.
So there is I would say, Konstantina, that there is first of all, an admission of ignorance to here on my part. I have, by training, sort of in the process of research, privileged the kind of sources that you talk about, and I have not engaged as much with the ones. As soon as I saw and I heard those names, I realized that are on my B list of all the books that I haven't.
We cannot do everything in one book.
No, but that's that's almost like admission of ignorance, which is fine, but it's also an easy way out. There are two other answers that I would want to give. The first one is the collaborative one. I mean, I feel like there is something great when you can offer a course in which you can give students different books that do different things, but that connect at a certain level. So in a way, it's so much better that we don't do this with every book. There is something to me that if we find that we try to cover our grounds with long introductions, huge long introductions in which, like I've seen many books that tries to sort of do like a 100 pages introduction to show that you've covered everything, and then the other chapters are much thinner. Mine is, I think, errs on the side of the research that I bring, and maybe rather than the comprehensive, even with Mediterranean studies, I engaged with very few figures and not in a kind of dialogue. So it is a book that is more a provocation in a way, and that can be utilized in connection with yours, with others, and with many others that are more historically grounded. Completely. And that's the second question, the second answer. The third one is the one that I would say, I'm actually gonna read just in my acknowledgements, where in a way the guiding star of Hayden White works for me, but in an unexpected way, but more the Hayden White of the last. Let me put it this way. I hope my explorations, my exploration of Mediterranean imaginaries in the making of Italians has responded to Hayden White's call for a historiography that nourishes readers by presenting them with a usable past to address the problems of the present. I see no more urgent task today than to reframe the question of collective identity, separate from metaphors or rootedness in land, selfhood, and chimeric historical truth, and to restore it to the fluid realms of the imagination and the poetics of relation. So you're right. There is a tendency for me to remain at the level of imaginary because my book itself wants to be a kind of imaginary product, or wants to unabashedly not hide that. And that's why those two metaphors show up in the title. I can't tell you how many times I've replaced the title, or I've been asked to do it, and then finally said, no, I need to have the courage to come up and say it as it is, and sort of alert the imaginary status of the book. So that's in a way where I tend to engage more with Derrida and with the geopolitical, the biopolitics, the discourse that has engendered then Franco Cassano's. And I want to end by reminding everybody that in a way my book is really dedicated to Franco, who just left us 2 weeks ago. He just died very recently, and it's been in a way I really wanted to ricordarlo in this occasion.
Yes, I think that Franco Cassano is really alive through your book. I really felt about that. And then I was happy because I'm going to teach him soon next year. So I was like very happy about that. But as you said about the imaginary, you know, I am a student of Banti myself. I did my PhD with him. And I know that when there was this cultural turn in Risorgimento studies, when he initiated the whole thing, and everybody was against him, and he would like you say, an ambassador, you know, culture can exist by itself. We don't need always to connect culture. So yeah, I know very well what you're talking about. I just wanted to provoke you. Okay, final question, maybe it's not a question, a short comment, and then we're opening it up. It's like one of the things that I appreciated here in your book is that you kind of remind us that Italy, the national imaginary of Italy, was from the beginning perceived as imperial. So you kind of remind us that the imperial project was not a fascist project. It started with liberal Italy early on, and it was very much connected to the southernism, meridianism, the question, southern question, and everything. You say that the Risorgimento produced an empire state, not only because somehow it occupied the southern kingdom, right, but also because it produced immediately a discourse about conquering. So I don't know if you want to comment, to say something more about this lost dichotomy between nation and empire.
Thank you. No, I think this is one of the sort of the most provocative notions. It certainly inverts some of the brava gente paradigm that we have been used to associate with Italian colonialism, although it's been, of course, criticized by hundreds of other historians before me. My colleague Stephanie Magliaom, of course, has also written a very important book entitled Empire's Mobius Strip about the kind of continuities of empire and its inscription within the Italian unification process. I think I wanted to make an argument in which the southernization and racialization of Southerners, which is seen as simply a late 19th century process, was already inscribed from the beginning. And so let's say that the motto that my book it rotates around is the Turinist motto that Garibaldi did not unite Italy, it separated Africa, more than the D'Azeglian refrain, Italy is done. Now we have to make Italians, in which both Italy was never done. It took decades for Italy to consider itself done, so it wasn't done at all. By the time D'Azeglio wrote, no, he never wrote that sentence. Of course, we know it was just utilized during fascism. So I do see that strong continuity between imperialism and nationalism, which obviously we identify with Corradini and then D'Annunzio and that sort of framework, but I located it also from the very beginning.
Thank you, Claudio. I have many more questions, but I will stop here and we'll see if there is time later. And I will open the floor to the participants to ask. We already have a question, but please feel free to either say right that you have a question in the chat, or use the hand raise function. So let's start. I will address this question that I see here from Natasha Tsangaraki, and I'm also interested in what she's asking. Do you find similarities with other Mediterranean cases? For example, the Greek role of diasporas in migration, or the islands, or whatever, or imperial nation, all these things. In fact, I was thinking about all these things while I was reading your book. And does your bipolar concept of the construction of the Italian state excludes the continuity of the Italian nation from the ancient and modern times? Well, yeah, but I think that it's very important, the comparative aspect, if you can tell us more about that.
This is, thank you so much for, as you say, always thank you for the question, but it's true that it took me 20 years to write this book, because before I settled on writing it, I kept trying to say, I cannot write a book on the Mediterranean unless I write it with another 10 scholars, and we all write it together. And in a way, I have to say that for as much as I read, even on the Greek case, which I'm passionately in love with, especially through the writings of Nikos Kazantzakis, I couldn't find enough, besides, of course, Konstantina's book on the 19th century and that tradition and that diaspora. But again, I hope that my book can be the kind of igniting sort of una miccia, something that can ignite the kind of research that the questioner talks about. I wasn't able to be satisfied. There's only one part in which I talk about the Aegean as the foundational sort of sea for the Greeks of the late 19th century. So the way in which the Mediterranean doesn't function in the same ways as it does for Italians, but as a metaphor, but certainly that's not sufficient. And I hope others will follow through with different Mediterranean imaginaries from different places.
Yes, I think, Claudio, it was very suggestive. It made me think so much about Greek history in similar ways. Also, how Greece was constructed as a nation empire from the beginning, like looking towards Constantinople and to remake the what they call the great idea and so on, and then the islands and diasporas. It's very, very similar. So it really opens the way to historians of Greece to write a similar book like that. Let's take the question by Salvatore Papalardo, and congratulations on your recent book, Salvatore. I look forward to reading it on Trieste.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Konstantina, and thank you, Claudio. A wonderful discussion. Thank you, Claudio, for a wonderful, wonderful book. I learned a lot, and I really, regret that you didn't write this earlier, so that it could help me thinking about my own issues. I'm really interested in the kind of futures in the past that did not materialize, and I feel like your book is full of these kind of potential directions that the Mediterranean could have taken at many junctures. And one of the things that kind of struck me was Altiero Spinelli, Il Manifesto di Ventotene, and the idea of the United States of Europe that was written on a Mediterranean island, right? But that has not, like, the European project that comes out of that is not very Mediterranean, right? It is a Mediterranean of hardened borders. And as a kind of literary historian, I'm always kind of curious at the kind of literary background. And Altiero Spinelli starts the Manifesto di Ventotene with an epigraph dedicated to Goethe. And that has always struck me as interesting. It's like, why Goethe, which he misquotes actually, and not Homer, right? What do you make of that kind of glaring paradox of a Europe imagined on a Mediterranean island that is not very Mediterranean? And I think that if that, post-war Europe had looked at the Mediterranean more, we would have a different kind of European Union today, and probably a very different situation when it comes to the migrant crisis.
Salvatore, thank you so much for this question. I'm actually, first of all, the answer to your question comes actually from Wu Ming Wan, if anybody. La Macchina del Vento. It's a novel that Wu Ming Wan just wrote and came out last year, in which he reimagines Ventotene as precisely along the lines that I'm talking about, and sort of the inspiration of the Manifesto di Ventotene comes from gods that come from ancient Greece, and an island that is stopped in time. It's an extraordinary historical novel and a new experiment by Wu Ming. So that's my first answer to you. The second, of course, is that you're perfectly right. It is a paradox, and the paradox is even more it's even stronger, because as I found out in my research, the inspiration for the manifesto came from an article by Luigi Einaudi, written in 1919, in which Einaudi specifically looked at Fiume as the hope for a new configuration beyond the nation state. So there's an incredible continuity between the Einaudi that identifies the actual sort of the diaspora in the La più grande Italia as the kind of extension of a Mediterranean imaginary to the diaspora. The Einaudi that writes about Fiume as the end, as supplanting the notion of sovereignty, of national sovereignty, and the manifesto. However, in the manifesto, that part is not as developed by the authors of the manifesto, and of course, but it's there. It's there. The federalism is connected there, but of course, Spinelli will go on to form the Federalist Party of Europe and the European Federalist Party, but that side will no longer be the crucial framework. So it is, of course, the post-war era that frames then the unification of Europe. And in that sense, I find that the document that comes out from at the same time that leads to the formation of ENI is much more where the inheritance of an idea of a federal, of a Mediterranean federation ends up in the activities of ENI up until, the death of Mattei, in which the Mediterranean is looked as the alternative to the Middle East, which was formed at the time from a geopolitical perspective. So I see both those moments as crucial moments of tension, of internal tension, and then they develop in different ways precisely because the conditions, of course, within which Europe then unifies are conditions that are dictated much more by the Cold War, including, of course, the processes by which the sort of European unification looks east and is driven east by the Americans to look east rather than to the Mediterranean. And that's where I find Derrida's call in 1991 for the Europe to look at its destiny into the Mediterranean to be really the most untimely meditation. I mean, really a kind of Nietzschean moment in which he identifies something that only 20, 30 years later will come to pass as the central question of European unification. Sorry.
Oh,
Thank you.
Salvatore.
Okay, so if you're done, we have another question here in the chat. I'm sorry if I cannot pronounce Kose.
TJ.
Okay, TJ. Okay, I'm sorry about that. So, Claudio, I'm reading it. I apologize for coming at this without too much of a background in Italian history, apart from what I've picked up from your wonderful books, Claudio. However, as someone interested in the Atlantic slave trade at the time when the imperial gesture in the Italian nation-state building is being developed and stabilized on the mainland, how is the Italian diasporic fishing net casting engaging with the circuits of slavery on the global coasts? Does the ocean become less benign in this imaginary, or is the Atlantic slave trade being resisted, undermined in complicated and hidden ways by Italian South Island immigration circuits? That's a very, very interesting question, I think. Wow,
TJ, he always has a way to offset me. So this is extraordinary question. I would say that I would start from seeing the fact that the Italian unification process takes place at the same time as the American Civil War. And Mazzini, for example, is very attentive to the metaphors of sort of the relationship of slavery with the South, and utilizes constantly the term, and I apologize for the term, but calls the Italians the Negroes of Europe, and sort of it animates it in the process of Italian unification. So there is a first connection there between the American Civil War, and of course then the Italian Civil War that ensues is the other second in the very same years of the American Civil War. Italy goes into a civil war, which is called Brigantaggio, but it is an actual civil war in which the Italian South now is racialized thoroughly. The Legge Pica is what actually constructs Southerners as the first Africans. It is applied, the Legge Pica, to the treatment of then imperial subjects during the scramble for Africa by other nations. So that's the first connection, that there is a process that does not involve the Mediterranean, but involves the Southernization and racialization of Italy. And this process, however, is picked up on the other side of the Atlantic when in 1907, the American begin to actually label Italian Southerners as with an S or an A as Africans or Southerners. They're the first whites to be distinguished as if they come from the South and they're identified by their names as coming from the South. At Liberty Island, they are signaled as A and or S. And this is something which brings you into this sort of murky a moment in which the history of slavery and the arrival of Europeans of racially constructed inferior stock intersects with that much longer time history. So I see the intersections taking place at both the level of the formation of Italy and then in the diaspora, in the way in which Italians in the United States are racialized. I would have to open up a whole new chapter to inquire more into the crux of your question, then I'm certainly going to be thinking about it more. But this would be the first two things that come to mind.
Let me add to this, Claudio, that one of the most fascinating aspects of your book is that race and racial theories are very present, and you give us really a very, very useful overview of the importance of race in the Mediterranean, which I think it's very helpful also in teaching. Let's see. We have so Francesco Maria Tedesco here. He writes very in a very synthetic way an interesting criticism to Cassano. But I see him here. Perhaps you want to talk, Francesco Maria Tedesco, instead of me reading your question? You're welcome.
No, I think that the problem with Cassano is that he reverses the Orientalism, and he writes a kind of second Orientalism or second Mediterraneanism. And so I criticize him. I'm sad because he passed away a few weeks ago. I met him, and he was very kind, very gentle person. But his theory, I think, has something which doesn't work, and I would like to ask Claudio to answer this question about Cassano's Orientalism in reverse.
Yeah. Francesco Maria, thank you for the question. And your book is one that I missed entirely, so I plead double guilty because you've written a book that I now ordered immediately and that I would like everybody to.
Yes, me too, I have to say, me too.
Yes, it is written in Italian, but it is a book about specifically the forms of Mediterraneanism and so sort of, and I imagine a very anti-essentialist one. Francesco Maria, although of course Franco has been my maître à penser, it doesn't mean that I haven't thought a little bit beyond also Franco. And so I chose actually the paradigm that has been elaborated by somebody else, still from Bari, but Luigi Cazzato, whose sort of term meridianism is the one that I use. And I think that the meridianism is precisely, or at least I hope we could discuss this, but it does not shift into, it maintains the kind of critical edge of Orientalism without reversing it into an essentialism. And I totally agree that Cassano's essentialism is part of the charm because of Cassano's overtly and open way in which he articulates some of the sort of more sentimentally held notions about the South, but it is not consistent with sometimes what he also advocates as the more meridiano the other ways in which his theory can be seen as non-essentialist. But the essentialist trait, I see it, and I try to deal with it by actually utilizing Cazzato's meridianism, which I find very convincing. Thank you.
So if there are no other questions immediately, let me just invite you to comment a little bit about your methodology of writing. This is a longue durée book, right? A longue durée, but you explore this longue durée through micro episodes or objects, specific objects. For example, the two ships at the end, you know, the Rex and the Concordia, that which serve as parabolic objects. But also you start the book with a specific object in the museum of Ischia, I think it's a museum, but also you talk all the time about specific monuments, localities, etc., and you have many pictures of these parabolic objects. So some way I can see Carlo Ginzburg there in its microhistory. Can you comment more on your methodology of writing?
That's very much the case. As I said in my introduction to you, my oscillation between Hayden White and Carlo Ginzburg is real. It's real in the framework of my writing, especially. I can't tell you how many times that chapter of the Longue Durée has shifted between the beginning, the end, pieces here and there. And at some point, I just wrote it in different chapters. And then all of a sudden, I just did that magic editing that we can do with cut and paste and put it all together, and certainly felt that it came together as such. So the process of writing, though, you're right, it always starts with an anecdotal moment, which is sort of a framing device. Which does bring that imaginary, sort of the cipher of the imaginary. For Ginzburg, it's more the trace to a hunting investigative process. I stop the process. I sort of put the image in, and you can always go back to that image if you lose your way in the narrative, because I try then to bring the narrative into other places and sort of enlarge it. But I think that image beginning, and I find one of the most, the image that is not there, but that it's much more dear to me, is actually the image of the altar to the fatherland that the Buenos Aires community wanted to build instead of the column faro that we have on the Gianicolo. And
it's an amazing story, this. Can you say more? Because it's really, I didn't know this story. So perhaps
I found it in Toate's book, and then I researched it and found out that it was very much the desire of the Buenos Aires community to link themselves to the Greek Emporia, and sort of to have an altar and dedicate an altar in the Altare della Patria to emigration, rather than put it as a faro on the Gianicolo. So the shift from that altare that the community wanted to, instead the Italian state decided, no, we'll have the faro that illuminates Rome. And so that kind of imperium image, contrary to the emporium, that's sort of the ways in which I sort of focalize with these images, anecdotal, but something that then is narrated throughout the chapter.
Mm-hmm. So Fernanda, hi Fernanda, you can speak.
Oh, hi Fernanda, so glad to see you.
Hi, ciao Claudio.
Ciao.
Hi everyone. So we're gonna have an event on your book in a bit with me. So I'm just gonna be brief, but use this opportunity to ask you something that won't be in the interviewer place. So just out of curiosity, how much do you think the Mediterranean also have an impact in the making of the Europeans, so more in general? So how much these images as the Mediterranean as the cradle of the civilization, and so something stuck in the past that we try to reach as Europeans, try to bring in, but just at the conditions that can be there. So it's a broader European questions, I would say. I know it's a bit out of the purpose of your book, but I was wondering what your thoughts are on this. If you were about to write a new book in this sense, what direction would you take?
I think this, my last chapter, as Konstantina was saying, it's very polemical. Let's be frank. I mean, I basically see Europe extending imperium by territorializing the waters of the Mediterranean and making the Mediterranean Mare Nostrum up to the 12 miles of the coasts. Everything that Europe is doing is basically an operation of Mare Nostrum.
And if I may say, Claudio, he has this amazing metaphor. I love it. When you say the underbelly of the Mare Nostrum is the Mare Aliorum. It's beautiful.
Yes, that's where I find it. This otherization of migrants has, however, also been the extension of the operation Mare Nostrum, called Mare Nostrum by Italy. It was changed into the new operation by the whole European Union, which has basically extended the territorial waters to 12 miles from the coast. And so that is the process by which I see imperium as now having become the foundational force within Europe. And that's where I find that there is no more urgent need than an emporium imaginary to develop alternatives. And the many associations in Italy, Grey 250 and many others that are fighting at a European level against the construction of Fortezza Europa and the Christianization of Europe. All of the paradigms that, that France, beginning with Giscard d'Estaing and Chirac, especially with these ideas of the Christian Europe that immediately excluded at the time any kind of discourse, which had been initiated by the King of Morocco, Mohammed V, in the 1950s with the Federation of oil-producing countries of the Mediterranean. And so the idea of a Mediterranean Federation was in some respect, even initially, more concrete than the European Union. And that's where the call to Mediterraneanize Europe is ultimately what I'm trying to politically, let's say, to launch as a
totally in support of it.
Yes.
Anyway,
thank you for asking this, Fernanda, because it was one of my questions, how political your book is in relation to Europe. So it's great that. So I think that we will take a couple of more questions because it's much more tiring to be on Zoom for more than 1 hour and a half. So, but let's see if you have a comment here, Claudio, or in this question by this culinary historian. So just as a culinary historian, I'm interested in your views on the way the concept of the Mediterranean diet developed in the 1980s, has been used to create the concept of Mediterranean, which then, as you said, boils down to Italy as a metonymy. Italy has become, through food, the Mediterranean, and more specifically, Southern Italy, despite the reality of history. And I may say so also Crete a little bit.
This is actually, and Francesco Maria is right, Vittorio Tetti wrote a beautiful article on this and many more works. But specifically, it's very important to remember that it actually starts in the 1950s, not in the 1980s. We associated with the 1980s, but the actual reduction of diet, and especially the pescatoria framework of the diet, so the utilization of fish versus meat, was a construction by American doctors that were very concerned with the rate of heart disease and heart attack connected to the consumption of red meat. So it was very much a kind of part of the globalization of the Mediterranean and the metonymic. If there is anything that is fundamentally Mediterranean, is pastorizia, is cheese and milk. I mean, and yet, you know, there is a kind of constant forgetting of the role that animals have played even on land, and certainly part of the Mediterranean diet of sort of the pastori was very different from anything that we imagined. So from that point of view, Tetti argues very convincingly, and I am sure that that Karima would agree, that this is precisely a reduction, a metonymic reduction of variety, syncretism, and hybrid, which is what we identify as Mediterranean if you've been lucky enough to be born or spent enough time in that area. So this idea of Mediterranean diet is part of that globalization, and I match it with both Italy as the seaside Italy as destination as Mediterranean destination, and also the development of Italian cinema in the passion for Mediterranean that Hollywood develops in the 1990s, from Mediterraneo to Cinema Paradiso to, of course, Il Postino, all the way to La Vita è Bella, which I would argue is precisely inscribable as the kind of Mediterranean view of the Holocaust, which is in some way for global consumption. And so Italy becomes a metonymy, and the Mediterranean diet is connected to very restrictive view of it, and which exclude also very much the social history of that separates very different ways of eating in the Mediterranean.
Thank you. So last word to my dearest colleague, Pier Mattia, who is sitting there in our office. And this is perfect because we're actually co-organizing together this Italian and Mediterranean colloquium series. So Pier Mattia, the word is to you.
Okay, first of all, I would like to thank you for this wonderful talk, and Konstantina for being in touch with you and organizing the first colloquium on Zoom, actually. So this is something new that is much more global than our meetings here in New York, even though New York is a global city. My question is about the relationship between the longue durée and the metaphors and imagery and imagination. No? So what did you learn writing this book and thinking 20 years about this book, about this relationship? Metaphors have long life, they change, they're related, how longue durée is a metaphor or itself, and so on. So these two concepts together, and could you expand a little bit more on that?
Okay, let me start from thanking Pier Mattia, because Pier Mattia was probably, when he invited me to present my project at the Mediterranean seminar, was one of the first times in which I had actually decided that finally it was time for the book to come. And the response of your seminar, Pier Mattia, was very, very important for me in making that decision. It was, I think, 6 years ago. So it took me a few more years to come to terms. But I want to thank you, besides Konstantina, of course, today. It's been wonderful for me, but also you for that. And then let me just make it very, very clear. What I find in the longue durée, and especially in the work of Marc Bloch, even more than Brodel, in the historian's craft, is the most wonderful, for me, way to reframe our understanding of history as not outside of the dialectic, but as an oscillation between permanence and change. That's what precisely sort of inscribes the imaginary and the longue durée, and also my Mediterranean imaginary. The oscillation between permanence and change is what I consider to be the foundational lesson in terms of temporality, and reimagining temporality, and whether it is the slow time of Cassano or the slow time of imagery. I feel like that's where sort of these moments that I call of transfiguration are the moments of change, but transfiguration in itself does also imply a sense of permanence, and that's where I think you hit the nail. For me, the longue durée is not only to go to the ancient Mediterranean, but it is also inscribed in the way in which I deal with the imaginary as something which is both structuring, but it is also one that it changes.
Thank you. Pier Mattia, you want to talk? Sorry.
I want to say thank you.
Okay, so we have one last comment, but I think we're over time, but let me just say the importance of the comment. I think it's very important. It's a question for all of us to think. I think it's very important because it connects Romanian history to this story. So you can see how your book opens up space to think different histories. So Nicola Mihai here, he talks about the Italian communities in modern Romania, starting from the second half of the 19th century. And he brings in a very interesting comment about how we can write, we can think the history of the small Italies in relation to the history of the great territory, or the history of Italy as a nation state. I will leave us all. I'm sorry, Nikolai, we're out of time. It's so very interesting. We can still be in touch. I think that it was really a very interesting discussion, very fruitful. It left so many questions open. Thank you so much, Claudio, for being with us. Thank you all for participating. I hope to see you in the next following event of the colloquium. Claudio, the last word is to you.
Well, my last word is that I put my my email address in the chat, because I'd love anybody who has any comment whatsoever to send me comments or to engage on any topic. I am ready for new collaborations, especially on any of this. I'm done writing books alone. I find now that I want to just launch, so any projects that you might have that might involve something that could be brought collaborative. I've initiated now my path towards transnational Italian studies with my program at UCSB with Stephanie Malia Holmes. So I'm very excited to go in Romania and in any other places. But I really want to thank everybody. Grazie, grazie, grazie. Evcharisto, para.
That's wonderful. We will do the next seminars in the Mediterranean, multilingual, right? Thank you all very, very much.
Here.
Have a good day. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.